in this. If your child is in doubt about what they are, then they can actually give them drugs to change them from a girl into a boy, and they don't tell the parents. So people are now reacting against this. People are marching in the streets and coming out because of this confusion that is going on within the society. And so these are very difficult times. And this is where we need to have beneficial knowledge. We need to be able to go to the sources, to go to the Quran, to go to the Sunnah, to the way of the Prophet ﷺ as our base, and then also be able to get knowledge from original sources, to go back to our sources in Islam, to our elders, to the people who came before us, in order that we understand who we are and where we are going. And so this conference, this symposium is set up in order to look at the different waves of Muslims who came into this region. There are Muslims who came here before Columbus. There are Muslims in the slavery period. There are Muslims in the indentured labor period of the 19th century. There's another wave of Muslims who came from the Arab world into this part of the region. There's a long history with great contributions, but the information is not available to people. And what we learned is that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. But the question that we ask is a simple question. How can you discover a place when the people are living here already? And I said Abdullah Hakim discovered Linden in 2020 because the first time I came here. This is a mental, you have to be insane to say something like this. When Columbus came, there was over 75 million people living here. Between North America, Central America, Caribbean, South America, 2,000 languages were being spoken. In Mexico, they had pyramids. They had high civilization. And in America, the indigenous people were organized. They had a confederacy of their tribes, which became the basis of the Constitution of the United States. And so, what Columbus said, he discovered the place. The reality is, we need to be able to deconstruct information, take it apart, and put it back together. That's what the challenge is in front of us. So, looking at Columbus, when he came into the Caribbean, he was actually lost. And he bumped into the Bahamas on his way to India. So he called the people Indians. They're not Indians, but he called the people Indians. So he was lost. And if we deconstruct and put back together, I would say Columbus was discovered in 1492. See the difference between the two? He was discovered because he was lost. And that's how we have to be able to reconstruct history according to the original sources and according to the people who are actually there on the ground. And so, out of this information that is coming forward, and I wanted to share something which we have been researching and it's now coming forward, and that is concerning African Muslims. What is the role of African Muslims in Islam? What is the history? What are the contributions? Because many of us, we are confused about our own family. My family, I was raised in the United States, but my grandmother came from Barbados, and she went to America in 1913, and she married an African American. My wife is Jamaican. I lived in Jamaica for 4 years. And so, we need to be able to go back to the original sources and to reconstruct our history, at least in our own minds. Because sometimes even Muslims themselves do not understand the real history of Islam. So I want to give you some information, and this is from our perspective, and looking at the contributions of early African Muslims to the onward flow of Islam. And this is something which Muslims historically were not supposed to do, because we're not a nationalistic, tribalistic religion. We believe all nationalities, all people are the children of Adam alayhi salam. Everybody. We're all brothers and sisters. And there's no difference between us. But because tribalism has come into the Muslim world, and because racism does exist in this world, it is important for us to be able to clarify certain points. There's some information that people aren't aware of. Number one, that African people, generally when you speak about African Muslims, what name comes inside of your mind? What would come in your mind? If I said an African Muslim or a black Muslim?
Bilal.
What name would come in your mind?
Bilal.
Bilal.
Radiallahu.
That's the first thing would come. And you would think he's the only person from Africa who was a Muslim. And he was a slave. So you try to combine the two as though African people were weak people, subjugated people, and the so-called Arabs freed them and brought them into Islam. The reality is, African people are not weak people. And historically, Africa was not a weak continent. When the Prophet ﷺ was born, that year was called Am al-Fil, the year of the elephants. Remember the story of the elephants? Surah al-Fil, Abraha. And during that year, the Ethiopian armies, the Christians who had conquered in Yemen, in the south of Arabia, they attacked Mecca. Because one of the pagan Arabs went into their churches and he defiled the church. So then the leader of the Ethiopian army, Abraham, said, okay, you do that to my church, I'm going to your Kaaba. So he took his army north and he attacked Mecca. And this army was one of the most powerful armies on the face of the earth. It had elephants. And the elephants in those days was like a tank in World War I, or helicopter gunship. Now it's like drones. It was a higher form of warfare. And so when the armies of Abraham reached the area of Mecca, the Meccans could not do anything but run away into the mountains, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent birds carrying baked clay from a high altitude. They dropped it on the army, and they destroyed the army, not the Arabs themselves. It was only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who intervened in order to save the Arabian Peninsula from the Ethiopian army. One of the great Persian philosophers named Mani, in the early part of AD, he said there were 4 great areas of power in this world. There was Rome, there was Persia, there was 3 kingdoms in China, and there was Ethiopia, Aksum, the Aksumite Empire. So they considered the Aksumites to be one of the 4 greatest powers on the face of the earth. So therefore, African people were not weak people. That's the wrong concept. And the Arabs at the time had a love-hate relationship. They were afraid of African people. And that's something that we have to understand when we go back into the sources. And it's also shocking when I learned Arabic and went into the sources, we also realized that the concept of blackness, aswad, is the term being used. Abyad means white, and aswad means black. Now today, according to racism, right? According to racism in America, the way we were, they said, if you're white, you're all right. If you're yellow, you're not a bad fellow. If you're brown, stick around. But if you're black, get back. That's a color line, what we call in South Africa apartheid, right? It's a caste system based on color. And this system influences the way people think. So when we look at history, we think like this. But the reality is, in early Arabic, the word aswad comes from sawada, and the word sayyid, which means master, also comes from the same root. Also siyada, which means power. So when you talk about aswad, it is not something weak. It is something strong, like the black stone, like how they want to put black on the Kaaba. The Prophet ﷺ, when he opened up Mecca, the height of his power, he wore a black turban. So this is a sign of power. This is not a sign of weakness. And this is very important, point for us to understand, because we accept Islam and we think that we're coming from a weak people, and other people must teach us. Yes, we learn Islam, but we have roots in Islam, deep roots. And the more we know about our history, is the more we can benefit from our faith, and we join the community of Muslims as everybody understands their lineage, they understand their roots, they understand their background. Now, what people don't understand about the Prophet ﷺ is that when his father had died, and his mother, Amina, became very sick, and she had a servant named Ayman, Barakah. She was an African woman. He was an Ethiopian. And when his mother was dying, they were going to visit the father's grave in Gaza. And the mother said to Ayman, take my son. Take him as your son. I give him to you. And from that day on, the Prophet ﷺ said, Ayman never left him, either physically or mentally. She never left him. And later on, when he married Khadija, Ayman was freed, and she stayed with the Prophet ﷺ, and eventually married Zayd. And we know their son was Usama, radiallahu anhu, of Usama. And Usama, of course, who is now half African and half Arab. And the Arabs were described in those days as brown-skinned and black-skinned people, by the way. When you go into the dictionaries, what is an Arab? And when they spoke about other nations, they said Banu Asfar, which is the people, the white people or the light people, they were talking about Romans. And when they said Banu Ahmar, the red people, they were talking about Persian people. But when they talked about themselves, they described themselves as Azami, which is dark-skinned people. So that is the reality that they were living in. The Prophet ﷺ was very close to women. And when they were in Medina, she migrated to Medina. And one time he was in the masjid and she came to the door, because there was no separation between male and female. There was just a male section and a female section. That's the original mosque of the Prophet ﷺ. And when she came in, he stood up. And he called her Ummi, my mother. That is the way how much he loved her. And when he spoke about Usama, he would say, أَنَا أُحِبُّ أُسَامَ إِلَّا فَاطِمَةَ. I love Usama more than anybody except for Fatima. That is the love that he had for Usama ibn Zayd. So this breaks down the concept of racism. That people have this in their mind. But that's not the only thing. We also find that amongst the early Muslims, there were many different famous Muslims. There was one of the Muslims, his name was Salim Mawla Abi Hudayfa, radiallahu anhu. And the Prophet said in one tradition, if you want to take the Quran from its original form, take it from 4 people. And one of them was Salim. And Salim was described as a black man. We don't know. And it's not something that we needed to teach in Islamic history. But now we're going to bring it out in order to make things balanced. There was also, amongst the companions, many people who we didn't know about before. Do you know that Bilal had a brother? Anybody know that before? Bilal's brother was called Khalid ibn Rabah. He was Sahaba. Did you know that Bilal had a sister? Did you know that? Her name was Ghafira. Ghafira bint Rabah. They were part of the companions. There was also companions, great companions, who were there like Julaybib. There was also Muhjah. The first person, one of the first people to die in the Battle of Badr was an African person, Muslim, described as an African person also amongst the Sahaba. There was also in Medina, Muhammad ibn Maslama, radiallahu anhu. He was described as the knight of the Prophet. That's knight, nobleman, horseman. He was a famous horseman, Ibn Maslama. He was described, he was not from the Ansars, or he wasn't from the Aus and the Khazraj. He was a client of them. He was what we would describe as an African person, tall, dark-skinned person, great horseman, security for the Prophet ﷺ, Muhammad ibn Maslama. A lot of people don't know that. There were many companions. And what is also not known so well is that the 5th year of the Prophethood in Mecca, when the Quraysh were attacking the Muslims, and it got really bad. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, said to his companions, you should migrate, you can go to Al-Habasha. That means Abyssinia, or today you say Ethiopia or Eritrea. You can go to Al-Habasha, for in it there is a king who does not allow oppression. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, وَهِيَ أَرْضُ صِدْقٍ. It is a land of truth. Go there until Allah will better your conditions. That's authentic hadith. So when he described Ethiopia, he said, هِيَ أَرْضُ صِدْقٍ. That's a land of truth. So before the Muslims went to Medina, before they went to Yemen, before they went to Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, Indonesia, Turkey, they went to Africa. And that is something that people do not understand. And they did not go to Africa as Arabs who are raiding slaves. If you read the Orientalist history books, it says that Arabs are taking slaves from Africa. That is a distortion. They went into Ethiopia as refugees. And the king, whose name was Ashama, his title was Al-Najashi. Al-Najashi, we would say the Negus. In his language, they called him Negash. Because if any of you know Ethiopia, he was a group of people called Tigray. The Tigray people. They're not Amharic, they're not Oromo, they're Tigrays. So he was a Tigray man, and he was the ruler of the Aksumite Empire. That is the great empire that man was talking about, one of the four great powers on the face of the earth. And they had accepted Orthodox Christianity. They had accepted Christianity. And there was a struggle inside of Ethiopia between people who believed in one God and people who accepted Trinity. So they had a struggle between Christendom, between those forces that were there. And so the Muhajirin, the migrants, went to Ethiopia. It's a long story, but in short, Al-Najashi, he is accepted them. And he gave them sanctuary. And the Meccans sent their people to bring them out. And so the king called the Sahaba. And Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, radiallahu anhu, who's the brother of Ali, radiallahu anhu, he read from Surah Maryam, descriptions of Maryam, may Allah be pleased with her, Isa alayhi salam, and the king, he cried. And all the people in his court cried, and he said, there's no difference between you and us. You're safe. So the Muslims stayed there until it was time to migrate. And at one point, the Prophet ﷺ, he gathered the companions together, and he said, make janazah, because one of your brothers has died. This is Najashi. And they made salatul janazah with wa'ib, that is janazah prayer for an absent person, the first time in Islamic history. Because Najashi, the emperor of Ethiopia, had accepted Islam. He had embraced Islam. But the war was going on in Ethiopia, and then all the Muslims were called to Medina. Now, what is not known so well is that 15 Sahabas died in Ethiopia. 15 Sahabas. And their graves are there in the town of Negash. I have a program online. If any of you go on YouTube, you can put in Untold Ethiopia. Untold Ethiopia. And it will give you a documentary film. We took a film crew into Ethiopia. And we went to Negash. We went to where the grave is. 15 Sahabas are buried there. And when it was time for migration, 32 Abyssinians, 32 Ethiopians migrated to Medina and joined the community. So not only did you have so many African Muslims who were already Muslim in Mecca, you also had 32 Abyssinians who became part of the community. And this generation, and this is an important thing, right? You know, because sometimes people will say, I'm not blaming people in the Muslim world, it's just ignorance, right? They think that Islam was not in Africa. They think that Islam was very weak only in North Africa. But it did not penetrate Africa. But the reality is, the first generation, those people in Mecca and Medina, those who migrated from Ethiopia, the Prophet ﷺ said, خَيْرُ النَّاسِ قَرْنِي ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ. The best of people is my generation. And then the one that follows them, and then the one that follows them. These are the best people. This is before Islam went to other parts of the world. And that flies in the face of tribalism and racism if anybody has the wrong impression about who African Muslims are and what is the reality of Islam in Africa. The Romans attacked the Muslims from the north, and they responded to the attack. Persians attacked from the east, and they responded to the attack. Allah gave them victory and they defeated the Romans, called Byzantines, and they took over all their territories, Syria, Jerusalem, all these areas, and they started to take back all the Byzantine territories. Right across North Africa. They went across. Until they reached the Atlantic Ocean. And as they went across, and they established Islamic centers all over North Africa, they found out that below the Sahara was the most lucrative gold trade in the world at the time. This is in the Niger River. Was present-day Mali and Niger and all these areas right there, Sahara region. And trade routes were developed. And the Muslims then had a brisk trade going across from North Africa down into West Africa. And some famous cities that were there, you might know some of the empires, the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, the Ghana Empire. They were great empires, many of them ruled by Muslims that were not part of the world. And it reached the point where the African Muslims were so powerful that one of their rulers, whose name was Mansa Musa, you probably heard about him before, right? And for those of you who are online, because everybody likes to Google everything, so they want to Google it, right? So put in your cell phone, who was the richest man who ever lived on earth? Was Bill Gates? Right? Who was it? The richest man who ever lived on earth, pound for pound, it's on your phone, is Mansa Musa, a black African Muslim. How do you say now Africans are poor people? How do you say that we need help? And that's what they're saying right now in Nigeria and in Mali. They're saying we have the uranium, we have phosphates, we have manganese, and you won't give us electricity? Get out of our country, man. Because this is ours. In the same way it was in the time of Mali and Songhai. Mansa Musa made pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 and he took with him 65,000 people to make Hajj. Think about that. Every country he traveled in, he changed the economy of the country. Because he had so much gold. And when he reached Cairo, Egypt, they couldn't believe what they saw. The Mamluk were the greatest warriors at the time. They gave him bodyguards to make Hajj. He made his Hajj and he came back, and everywhere he went, he built the masjid, he built madrasa, and he fell in love with a city which is called Timbuktu. And Timbuktu is right on the top of the Niger. It's the most northerly city. So it became a center for the gold trade. The African Muslims brought the gold to Timbuktu, and the Tuaregs, the Berber people, would bring salt, and they would bring leather goods and other goods, and they would trade, right? So Timbuktu became a great center. You know what the Europeans did? They made a joke out of Timbuktu. You know, when I was growing up, they would make a joke. They said, go to Timbuktu. Like that's on the moon. Right? Timbuktu was a center of knowledge. And it is reported that in the 16th century, that's 1500s, right? In Timbuktu, there was 150 schools. Every man, woman, and child in the city was Muslim. 100%. Everybody was literate. Everybody could speak Arabic and write Arabic. They had their own languages as well. And the Sankore University, 16th century, had 25,000 students. This is black Africa. This is Muslim Africa. That's before all the universities in Europe and France and London, America. 25,000 students. They were studying not only Islamic studies, so-called Quranic studies, whatever, but they were studying astronomy, medicine. All of it is Islamic studies. And great centers of knowledge were opened up across West Africa. But as time went by, the desert, the ocean opened up for trade. So you didn't have to go across the ocean, across the desert. So people started coming by boat. And the Europeans then, the Muslims then, lost power in Andalusia. This is 1492. You know they say Columbus discovered America in 1492? That's not the important thing about 1492. The important thing is that the Muslims gave up authority. They surrendered to the Catholics in Granada, in Spain, in 1492. And Columbus then convinced the king and queen to send him across to get gold. That's the reason why the Spanish and Portuguese came to this part of the world. They came to get gold. They did not come as innocent exploiters. They came to exploit the land and to bring it back. And so across the ocean, Muslims started to go. You know what's the shocking thing to find out? You know the story of Al-Umari, right? Remember Mansa Musa? So he reached Cairo, and they said to Mansa Musa, where did you get this power from? And he said, my older brother Abu Bakr, he went into the ocean with 2,000 ships. He never came back. 2,000 ships. This is the Mandingo people, Mandinka. We would say Mandingo. 2,000 ships. And if you look at the distance between Senegal, Gambia, right? And you look at Brazil, it's only like about 2,000 miles. It's the closest crossing in the Atlantic. And there are currents. The currents will take you across. You don't even need sails. The currents will take you right across, and you will land either in Brazil or you will go to Barbados. You land in Barbados. And so the Mandinka Muslims came across, and they reached the Amazon region. We have documented proof of their presence on the Amazon, into Panama, Central America, up into the United States. And a Harvard University scholar named Leo Weiner, who wrote Africa and the Discovery of America, he showed how African Muslims, they mixed with the indigenous people of America. So Muslims were in this part of the world before Columbus. And it is our intention to document this information and inshallah to make it available to our communities, to the libraries, to the schools, to the public, to start to tell the truth about Columbus and what actually happened. During the slavery period, when African people were enslaved and political prisoners were brought across the ocean, we have documented proof to show that somewhere between 15 to 30% of the enslaved African people in the West were Muslims. This was not known before, because they purposely covered it up. But now we have written documents, eyewitness reports, autobiographies written in Arabic. We have so much information that is coming to the surface. We find Muslims in the United States who were establishing themselves. In Jamaica, the Muslims were part of a society in Kingston, and when slavery was abolished, the British sent a man named Robert Madden to Jamaica, and he was to make the change between slavery and indentured labor. And he had served some time in the Muslim world, in Damascus, so he could speak Arabic. And he came to a group of African people in Kingston who said they were Christians, but he listened to them and they're speaking Arabic. So he turned to them and he said, La ilaha illallah. And then they started to read the Quran. He said, quiet. Who are you? And they said, we are Muslims, a society, and we communicate with other Muslims in Arabic, in the country. And they wrote a document called Wathiqa. And this Wathiqa, a great rebellion started in the Manchester parish in Jamaica, based on this document. And it's right around the same time that a great Wathiqa was written in West Africa. One of the great scholars of Islam in West Africa, Shaykh of Sokoto, Iraq, and I studied him in detail. He wrote a book called Wathiqa ibn Tuli ila Ahlu Sudan. This was his declaration of independence. His declaration of independence. And so that Wathiqa, that was a call for jihad, resistance, it reached the Caribbean region. In Trinidad, there were Mandingo Muslims who were freed Muslims, and they formed a society outside of Port of Spain. And the free Mandingos, they would go to the boats and they see as many Muslims on the boat, they take them, and they had an Islamic society in Port of Spain. In Brazil, in Bahia section, Salvador, in Brazil, the Yoruba Muslims were so strong that they formed a mini Islamic state. And they had an emir. They were so strong that the Portuguese said, take these ships and go back to Africa. We can't take it anymore, go home. So they went home, many of them went home, and right now in Lagos, you can pray in a mosque in Lagos, which is called Brazilian Mosque. Imagine this, which was built by African Muslims who were enslaved and they returned. And their identity is there, known by African people. Suriname, there was the Maroons, right? And the leader of the Maroons was Arabi. And his general was called Zamzam. And the Maroons defeated the Dutch. And up until now in Suriname, there are Maroon communities up until today. Alhamdulillah, many Surinamese now recognizing roots. People are all recognizing roots. In Jamaica, in the maroon section of Jamaica, there's also a lot of people accepting Islam. They have a place in a compound in Jamaica which is called Juma Hole. It's a huge hole that is there where water was collected, and the Muslims used to make Juma there. So it is documented now. It is clear. The Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture, the greatest victory that we have in this region, the first country to defeat the Europeans on the ground. Before Toussaint Louverture, the revolution started in the plantations. Macandal, Bookman. These are Muslim leaders called Marabu, or we call them Arabic Murabits. They were traveling scholars, and they started the revolution. Toussaint Louverture organized the revolution. He organized it, and they defeated the French. So this is the history that we are bringing out, changing the narrative. What was the Muslims famous for? Amongst the enslaved people, the Muslims were famous for three things. One was Tawheed. It was their strong belief in one God. Second was Tahara, and that is purity. Purity of mind, of body, of soul. And third, Al-Amru bil Ma'ruf wal Nahy anil Munkar, calling to the good and forbidding evil. Many of the slave revolts, Muslims were involved, not only Muslims. There was Ashanti, there was Koromanti, there was Wolof, there were so many nations, but the Muslims were right involved in the slave rebellions. Up until Guyana, they're saying now we need more proof, but they're saying that when the Coffee Rebellion, when they signed the treaty, the scribe wrote it in Arabic. So in the rebellion here in Guyana, there was Muslims. And we are encouraging people now to do documentation, to go back in the archives, and to show the roots of African people here in Guyana, and we can connect it easily with Islam as we are connecting it to other parts of the world. So this is our legacy. And Alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us to be Muslim. At this point, at this confusing state of time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us with faith. We have those three principles, which are great principles, Tawheed, that we hold on to the wonders of Allah and stay away from shirk, polytheism, whenever we can. We also try to purify our families, purify our thinking, and help the community to come out of sexual immorality. Remember fitna to shahawat, right? The fitna of desires. Islam is the answer. And calling to the good and forbidding evil. This is not easy to do. And when you are a Muslim, and it gets hot, it's even a little bit hot here in Guyana. Do you feel a little hot?
Yeah.
I'm feeling a little bit hot too. It's not usually this hot, right? In Canada right now, where it's cold, right? It's 30 degrees centigrade. Canada. Right, it's hot. So people in Canada, when it gets hot, they take their clothes off. But Muslims who live in the heat put on clothes. So people will look at you and they say, you're strange. You're really strange. You go to the bank and they say, Mr. Abdul, would you like to have interest on your account? And you say, no, I don't take interest. And they say, you're strange. On Friday night, Saturday night, people are drinking their rum, smoking their slip. We don't do that. They say you people are strange. But I want to give you glad tidings that the Prophet ﷺ said, Inna al-Islam bada'a ghariban wa sayahudu ghariban fatuba lil-ghuraba. He said Islam began strange and it returned to being strange. So glad tidings to the strangers. And they said, O Messenger of Allah, who are the ghuraba? And he said, Alladhina yuslihuna inda fasad al-nas. They are those people who repair themselves. They repair society when the people have become corrupted. These are the ghuraba. They repair their own life and they repair society, Islam of the society. So I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give us that ability to repair ourselves and our families and to be part of the movement to bring up this community and this society and this region. And I pray that Allah will bless you and your families and this masjid to continue to grow and your children to be Muslim, your children's children. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept us and make our last word to be kalima la ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I leave you with these words. I ask Allah to have mercy on me and you. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
عليكم السلام.
وعليكم السلام.
الله تعالى وبركاته.
ما شاء الله.
No. What?
Any questions also?
Yes, questions.
So if anybody has any questions, you can take for a while. I'm on a tight schedule because we have a big program tomorrow morning.
Oh.
I'm on a very tight schedule.
Okay.
But inshallah, we'll take some questions. I finished my mission already on the travel, right, Gemma?
Ah.
So I'll be leaving, straight away to go back. But floor is always very general questions on anybody else. Floor is open. Yes, ma'am.
In your opening remarks, you mentioned about the OIC, about this being one voice. This question is not relevant to your main body of the lecture. But what is the OIC voice and what is happening in Palestine?
Yeah, so what is happening with the OIC, it's the second largest organization in the world after the United Nations. And it was formed in 1969 when the Zionists attacked Masjid al-Aqsa. And so Muslims said, we can't take this anymore. We don't have a Khalifa, and we don't have a ruler. So,
from the etiquettes of the student of knowledge and the reality of the pseudo scholar in studies by Shaykh Dr. Saleh bin Fawzan bin Abdullah al-Fawzan. Now on Amazon, paperback and hardback.
فاسألوا أهل الذكر أي العلماء إن كنتم لا تعلمون. هذا فيه أن الجاهل يسأل أهل العلم ولا يسأل غير أهل العلم من المتعالمين.